Good morning, everybody. Thank you. Welcome you all to the first ICM meeting. Ask Greg to do the Karakia.
Morena tātou. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga, kia mā kinakina ke uta, ia mā ta rata tara ki tai, e hi aki ana te atakura, he tio, he hoka, he hauhu, ti hei Māori ora.
Thank you, Greg. To confirm the meeting open and hopefully we'll be finished by 12:40. Is there any apologies? Yeah, Tip is here for apology for lateness. Is there any others? That's it. Yep. No, you have a seconder, please. Yep, thank you. All those in favour? Any disclosures of interest? Oh, sorry. So can we confirm the agenda first, please? Yeah. No, thank you. Second. All in favour? Yeah. Yeah, is there any disclosures of interest? No. Move it, please. No, we don't. I don't. Okay, sorry. Greg.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So we've got a range of staff here to support your meeting today, and you'll meet them as we go through the our agenda items. But just by a brief note of introduction, so just running down the back of the room there. So we've got Patrick Whaley, our manager of Biosecurity Biodiversity, Natasha Granger, our team leader Biodiversity, Grant Blackie, manager Waikato West Coast. We've got Jacob Dexter, who's in our biodiversity team. We've got Inga Voss, who's our media communications person. We've got Dave Wade, our manager business and technical services. Adam Munro, manager flood protection, land drainage. Emily O'Donnell, all the way from Whitianga, our manager Hauraki Coromandel, and Julie Beaufort, our program manager for Shovel Ready, also from Whitianga. As I said, we'll meet the team as we go through today, as we go through the agenda.
So thank you, Patrick. Can you please do your presentation?
Morena, councillors. Yeah, so if it's okay through the chair, I'd like to essentially take this report as read, but I've just got 2 or 3 points I'd like to highlight and then leave ample time for questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I guess the first thing is that we'll be bringing a comprehensive annual report through the next meeting, which I believe is in September. So that'll be the whole biosecurity program laid out like we have done in previous years. But we have provided quite a lot of detail in the status report. Yeah, so hopefully it's helpful.
We're just, sorry, just before we carry on, just for members, particularly those new to the committee. So what we're looking at here is for each activity that ICM looks after, there's an overall status report that's provided. So this will be the one covering biosecurity and biodiversity. There'll then be supplementary papers under each activity which dive deep into some other topics for discussion today. But that's generally how we've structured the agenda today.
Thanks, Greg. So yeah, the first thing I'd like to point out is just to follow on from the workshop that we had, just talking about alligator weed. It's fair to say that this wet, warm, and windy year has made this program really difficult to implement. We've done pretty well, but with the high water levels and continual rain and wind making spraying difficult, we've fallen behind a little bit. We're still quantifying exactly what the delays mean for the program, and so we'll bring that to you in September, a bit more of a detailed breakdown. Despite the wet, warm and windy year, we have actually done really well of our animal pest control. The contractors have been out there in all weather conditions, and there's only one of the operations that they're going to delay, and that's a combination of the weather plus we've struggled with bait supply. So really excellent results for the program there. So that was all I wanted to highlight for biosecurity. Given we've got a biodiversity supplementary paper coming up, the only thing I really wanted to mention was we're doing really well in that Natural Heritage Partnership Program. All the groups are performing well and sort of doing what they've said they will do for the funding they've received. They've continued to leverage other funds to keep the projects going, and the numbers of hours they put in are just staggering. So really cool program, but it is heavily oversubscribed, like we've said previously, and that's only getting, I guess it's compounding every year as the groups take on greater number of projects, a greater scale, and the complexity of things they're trying to bite off. And that was all I really wanted to highlight. So, over to you for questions.
You.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. I just want to refresh, please, the budget on page 7. The 4 million, is the contestable stuff, natural heritage, etc., included in that, or is it separate? So what's the source of the 4? And I'm assuming that the bits and pieces of biodiversity that come about a result of the catchment work are not included in that 4 as well. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah. So the source of the 4?
That's that partnership program as
It
well.
is.
So it's our priority sites, lakes.
All from that $5.80.
So there's a split between the UAGC, so the Uniform Annual General Charge, which funds the priority sites work, and then the Natural Heritage Fund that funds the EIF.
Yeah.
Part of it.
So where I'm going, just wanting to make sure the committee will understand that, with a view if the council's of a view to look at increasing it going forward, we all know sort of the basis for where it's coming from. If that.
So we'll do a bit of a breakdown of the natural heritage funding that I hopefully will have a workshop and there'll be a much more detail of that part of the.
Thanks. Yeah.
Are you going to tell us anything today about the new freshwater incursion, biosecurity incursion that's occurred in the region?
No.
You're not? Okay, that's all right.
Yeah, just speaking to that. So that's a matter that MPI are looking after,
Right.
and they'll look after the communications as well.
Yeah.
In due course.
Yeah. So, but are you guys in any way involved? Or?
Yes, we are.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks. Hi, Patrick. Just regarding PPCAs, council measures its performance based on the number of pest animals killed. Is that right? RTCs, etc. Thresholds have to be met to be called a successful operation.
Yeah, so we use residual trap catch to do our performance.
Yep, and so when those are met, that's classed as a successful operation.
That's correct.
Yep. Does council do any monitoring of native wildlife, omnivores, insectivores, carnivorous species that are living in those successful operation areas to see how they're doing year after year?
No, we don't.
I think I mentioned probably 9 years ago that the same issue, that doesn't seem to be any measures on a successful operation for the wildlife we're trying to protect, as opposed to knocking down pest numbers. For example, areas where I visit a lot of areas in the wild, in NZ, and my observations are where in some of the areas that are doing the best for native wildlife, it's areas where there's no predator control undertaken. So my point is, do you think there will be any monitoring of native species going forward in regard to so-called successful aerial operations?
That's a great question. So in some cases, we've relied on the Department of Conservation to undertake monitoring, and they've done it on private land together with community groups and Karakia forest, where in the last 20 years, the kōkako numbers have gone completely amazingly well. And I think I've previously reported that through ICMC, but happy to bring it back. The second point I'll raise is we did try and get some funding through the last long-term plan for essentially what's classed as tier 2 monitoring, or monitoring the investment you make in biodiversity interventions. That wasn't forthcoming, so we'll be looking for that sort of funding, hopefully through this LTP.
It'd be a good thing because, yeah, kōkako, they are doing well down there. Well, they're certainly present in Puriora, but that's a single species and sort of a, what is it, a nectivorous type bird, as opposed to the omnivores or insectivores, etc., that are more impacted in these sort of aerial operations. Another question I just had there was 123,000 hectares managed in the last year or so. What percentage is aerial? For example, I asked Department of Conservation some years ago, and they provided a response that in the Waikato region, 65% at that time was aerial operation management. I just wondered if that's changed. Has it gone up?
For the Department of Conservation, that's not our program. So ours is majority ground.
Is it? Yep.
By
Farms, like a lot of farm control work.
And a lot of small remnants.
Yep.
So we're only working on private land, and so I think it's a whole less than 5%.
Okay. Just one other thing here. Retention of staff and recruitment of staff has been difficult for contractors. Any particular reasons for that, or is that just something we're seeing all over the country with regard to recruitment?
I believe it's ubiquitous across the board. It's hard to get people to do field work. Not many people wanting to do it. It's really hard work. So contractors around the world, around the country for wilding pines, just as much as animal pest control, have been struggling to get people. But it's not just that sector. It's across the board for flood protection, contractors, everything. It's just tricky to get people.
Thank you, Patrick. Yeah, be keen to see what we could do with getting more monitoring for native wildlife if we're calling operations successful. Thanks.
Mike, thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Patrick. The Damer, how's the fence line, or any of the fence line started yet? And have you had any more sightings of them outside that area? I know one was seen in Kinloch.
I'm not entirely sure where we've seen them, but we're still getting sightings. A wallaby outside the containment area, like from Kinloch, Turangi, Huntly, Coromandel. So we're getting them in a range of places.
So how's the fence? Have you started the fence line?
Yeah, the fence line started. Yeah, we've had a few issues with weather, yeah, and theft of materials.
So what's the completion date?
I would have to get back to you on that.
Thank you. Could you just pull your mic towards you? Yeah,
Sure.
I'm just struggling a little bit. Thank you, Patrick. Bruce, thank you.
Well, Patrick partly answered the question before, but I will persist on a couple of matters. So I think the key point in relation to the bird response is that the bird response is actually well known across the region. And kokako are not only frugivorous, nectivorous, but they're also omnivorous. They eat, one of their main prey, like food items is actually bagworms down at Porirua. So they have quite a wide diet. Important to remember that. Also, it's important to remember that the connection between the body of research and what are called indicator or umbrella species, and kokako is the umbrella species for many of the parts of our region. A long decades of research has demonstrated that if you look after the umbrella species, everything else follows. I'd also like to comment on the fact that, in fact, some private landowners within the private the priority possum control area are doing their own monitoring, myself being one. And in the Wainaro district, the response in particular for korimako, the bellbird, the kormako, has been absolutely immense as a result of that possum control. At the same time, of course, there's other forms of pest control often going on from private landowners where the possums are being dealt with and rats are being looked after by a number of private landowners as well. So there has been significant response. So I also do support the notion of fuller monitoring to understand the response, but I just wanted to make those points about where we are currently at, the state of the system at the moment. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Bruce.
Yeah, so just on that, thanks, Bruce. We do monitoring for our Halo program as well, and that's seen TUI numbers go, again, almost exponential growth, both in the places that we undertake pest management, but also in the urban areas, Hamilton, Cambridge.
Okay.
Just in regard to Bruce's comment again, what we're finding is areas, for example, where aerial operations are undertaken repeatedly year after year after year. Species like kiwi are being eradicated. And even the research is struggling to show any benefit at all over long periods of time. So there are individual species that are suffering in these areas, and I think it's pretty well documented. Just regarding the wallabies,
I would refute that, Councillor Graf. I think that's hearsay, to be honest. I think if you go back to the scientific body that is across New Zealand, that would be disproved relatively simply.
So I stand to disagree with that as well, and happy to go into that further and take people out to show them the difference as well, because I think a big part of research is actually observation, and we're not seeing so much of observation. But anyway, look, just one last thing, Patrick. Wallabies, is there any record being kept on the number of wallabies killed in these controlled areas?
That's a question that's come up before at council, and at the moment our primary focus is trying to contain them. So if we don't limit their distribution now, the cost of trying to move towards eradication will be so great that this country won't be able to afford it. So the idea is find the areas where they're extremely low density and control those, and we'll hopefully stop them spreading and then push them in at a later date. So the numbers killed are not overly important at that point.
So no record of animals killed?
Only in areas where there's one or two. So outside the containment area, where you might be hunting one or two animals that have been moved there or moved them there themselves.
I think that's probably something pretty simple to have records kept. Maybe we could look into that. Just getting records of numbers gives an indication of populations.
It's not really possible. We do keep them for where we're doing night shooting operations. It's fairly simple because you can see the animal. But where you're doing an aerial 1080 operation, you have no idea how many animals you've killed.
No, that's right.
And the most important thing is how many are left.
sorry, Bruce.
Yeah, look, it's really important that as a committee, we understand the difference between anecdote, observation, and evidence. And I just wanted to say that really, because decades of research does not support the comment from Councillor Graff, does not support those comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Warren, thank you.
Yeah, hi, Patrick. Hey, can you just expand on where in the Coromandel they've been seen?
There was a reporting near Kennedy Bay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any more questions? No. So I'd like to get the biosecurity and biodiversity paper be received. Yeah, sorry. And for the Stu and Noel, thank you. All in favour? Right, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like
Thank
to
you.
welcome Natasha to the table now and we have a deep dive into our Coastcare and priority biodiversity sites.
Morena. Can everyone hear me all right? Yep,
Thank you.
cool. So yes, I'm going to be presenting the Coastcare and Priority Biodiversity Sites program. I've got a short presentation that hopefully will be on screen in a sec. And just while that's coming up, I know Greg's introduced, but Jacob's here. Jacob joined us at the middle of December last year, and he's he's the unit lead for Priority Biodiversity Sites in the Coastcare program. Thank you. If you could go to the next slide, please. Waikato has a very diverse region in terms of its ecosystem types, making it one of the most diverse regions in New Zealand. This is due to our altitudinal, latitudinal and longitudinal variations. So we vary from sea level to 2,700 metres, and we have both west and east coast, so a very diverse region. And I just wanted to set the scene before I talk about two programs that we have for Coastcare and priority biodiversity sites. So I'll take Coastcare first and then go into priority biodiversity sites. Next slide. Coastcare is a community partnership program that works to restore coastal ecosystems throughout the Waikato, and it involves local communities, iwi and government organisations to work together to restore the coast and the species that live there. There's about 20 Coastcare groups in the Waikato region, and last year the Coastcare program undertook approximately 31 planting bees at 27 locations, about 3,000 volunteer hours, and about 31,000 plants were planted. This year we're now in full swing planning for our planting bees, and obviously because of the damage caused by the cyclones this year, we'll be focusing on the Coromandel this year. We've seen an increase in demand for projects to be up on those areas hit by the cyclones. Some groups, such as the Whangamata Dune Protection Society, formed because community members observed how restored and non-restored dunes responded differently during times of storms. And the Whangamata planting this year will be the largest single Coastcare restoration undertaken on the Coromandel, with an approximate 700 metre section of eroded dune to be restored this year. If you go to the next slide, it just is an overview of the geographical spread of our Coastcare sites, just to show that we're working on both the west and east coasts of the region. And in the report, we talked about how we partner with other partners, including TCDC, where we have a shared coordinator to organise those sites. Next slide. Natural dunes play a vital role as a buffer between the land and the sea, and they reduce the inland impacts of coastal erosion and inundation. And the dune width is a measure of resilience to future change. It's important to note that coastal erosion is a natural process, but that the loss of disturbance or native vegetation can prevent recovery of sand dunes and putting the land behind the dunes at greater risk. On fluctuating shorelines, dunes are self-repairing barriers that can safeguard against coastal hazards such as inundation and erosion. Next slide please, to protect people's property, infrastructure like roads and dune ecosystems, Coastcare's focus has been supporting the restoration of natural coastal ecosystems and buffers, and it's what we call soft engineering. Hard infrastructure such as seawalls is only used as a last resort. And this diagram is just to illustrate that structures such as seawalls do not let the natural process of erosion and accretion occur, leading to erosion of beaches with no chance for recovery because you have this hard structure preventing accretion. I'm just going to show some examples. We'll take Pawanui next slide. This slide shows the earthworks, completed earthworks ahead of planting. And that's 2002. Yep. And then if you switch to the next slide, this was a few weeks after planting. See the plants along that stretch that was shown, taken from a different direction. Some wind barriers to allow the plants to establish. And then one of my colleagues took the next photo in April, so just a few weeks ago. We switch to the next slide to show how well that dune is recovering. So yeah, April 2023 in that photo. I will stop there and ask for any questions on Coastcare before I go into priority biodiversity sites.
Yeah, no, thanks, Natasha. It's good. Hey, just curious, has the damage from four-wheel drives and stuff on the West Coast decreasing, I guess?
I'm not sure I could answer it's decreasing. It's certainly a problem that we're working through. Yeah. I'll carry on. So I'm going to talk about the Priority Biodiversity Sites program. So I'll have the next slide, please. To ensure that we make the most difference across the region, we have prioritised sites that have biodiversity on private land. And the map on the right, I know it's too small, but it's just to give you an indication that we have the highest priority in red and the next priority in green. There's an emphasis on us working on ecosystems that are underrepresented on public land. So for things like lowland forest, the DOC estate or the public conservation estate has large tracts of upland forest, less so of the lowland forest. And so those are an area that we work on quite regularly. We also have a focus for threatened ecosystems and naturally uncommon ecosystems. And I've given some examples there in the slides. The way this program works is that we work with community groups, landowners, and we leverage funding from other funding streams, things like QE2, Trees That Count, Waikato Catchment Ecological Enhancement Trust, and internally with the Catchment group on supporting projects that not only support biodiversity, but catchment and soil conservation as well. I'm going to use an example just to give you an example, because obviously I can't talk about all 40 sites that we have on the books this year. So if we go to the next slide, I'm using Toruparu wetland as an example. The map on the right just shows that it's located north of Aotea Harbour. It's a 223 hectare wetland. It's regionally significant. It's a regionally significant natural area and a high priority biodiversity site. There is a small amount of DOC land in the wetland, but most of it is privately owned. There are numerous threatened species present, including bittern or mataku. The area has a long history of mana whenua occupation and use, and it's got numerous archaeological sites, including numerous pars and middens. So it's a really special place for a range of reasons. There are several restoration projects occurring in the Toruparu wetland. They're led by the toi whenua and the catchment owners, and they have support from the council, from the Department of Conservation, and Manaaki Whenua Land Care Research. The wetland is located on a valley floor and it's surrounded largely by sheep and beef grazing, some exotic forestry, and it has some regenerating secondary forest as well. Funding from the biodiversity work stream and the catchment management stream has provided fencing to replant and replanting on different properties. And we've also worked alongside DOC to provide pest control operations for private landowners. If we go to the next slide, it just shows an aerial shot of the wetland just to give you an idea of the scale. And it shows, how big it is. And then the next slide has the pink lines showing the land parcels. And then the green shaded areas are projects that have been completed in previous years. And then at the moment we have 3 current projects in and around Toruparu wetland. The first one, property 1 at the top. Fencing has started and will be finished this year. And that's been a split between Catchment New Works and Priority Biodiversity sites. Property 2 is a 3-year project, and that's included providing traps, planting and fencing. Again, it's a split between Catchment and Priority Biodiversity works. And we've also provided some traps and plant guards to prevent browsing on the plants that had been replanted. And property 3, fencing is being completed this year and planting next year. And again, it's a joint project between the Catchment Workstream and Priority Biodiversity sites. So quite a bit happening at this particular site, given its largeness and specialness. And then the last slide is just an example of those plant guards that I talked about at one of the properties that was planted last year. And then the last slide, many of our projects, priority biodiversity sites, are reactive or initiated by others, including landowners who have contacted us for assistance. We're now entering a stage where we're going to take a slightly more strategic approach and just make sure that we're protecting the full range of biodiversity in this work stream. So this year we're going to be doing a stock take and gap analysis to determine that we're working across a full representation of ecosystem types and to make sure that we're aligning our work to focus on those of highest priority. And that will help us inform planning for future years. Managing expectations of what's realistically achievable within budget, within what private landowners are wanting to achieve or can achieve, and technical constraints is sometimes challenging at these sites. We can't fund sites indefinitely, and so we focus on ensuring projects are carried forward by local communities and landowners so that the benefits that we've achieved through our involvement are not lost. We have significant tracts of multiple Māori-owned land in the region, and we're currently exploring different ways to support restoration projects or biodiversity protection on those lands. We've also recognised the need to monitor biodiversity outcomes at priority sites once our investment has ended. We are hoping that we'll be able to recruit for a monitoring role, and this will assist with measuring our outcomes at these sites we've invested in. And that's all I've got to say. Any questions?
Thank you.
Yeah, look, thanks for that, Natasha. That's a really interesting report. Just a couple of questions about alignment. So how do the key ecological sites and the work on, well, as you're calling them, priority biodiversity sites, how does that align with process relating to significant natural areas? What is the degree of overlap between places that are deemed to be a significant natural area and what you're talking about today? And my second part of the question is, do you have a requirement, you know, because you're talking about investing rates money on private land, do you have a requirement in relation to landowners connecting with Ngā Whenua Rahui or QE2? I mean, is there actually statutory protection before public monies are spent? Can you just focus on those?
Yep, I'll answer that bit first, and then I'll go back to the first bit. We encourage landowners to protect land, whether it's through a covenant in gross that we can put on the title or through QE2 or some other, or Ngā Whenua Rahui. At the moment, there's no requirement for us to do that over a certain amount, like there is in Catchment, but that's something that we're exploring so that when the investment is of a significant amount, that there is some form of protection or covenant on that property. So it's a working area at the moment.
Yeah, because the protecting the investment is critical, and the changes, usually it happens at the point of change of ownership of land. And I know of examples, including, in fact, one of the ones you've just shown me, where a change in landowner can lead to a completely different approach. So anyway, that's okay that you're exploring that. Thank you.
Yep.
And then the other part is the alignment of the SNOs.
So my understanding is that SNAs are identified by local council, district councils with support from us. And so they have different criteria for how they determine what is a significant natural area, and they vary. We've taken an approach where we've looked at a range of measures and done a zonation analysis by John Leithwicks that you'll be familiar with. And that looks at representativeness, forest or ecosystem type, and a range of measures to see if we're protecting the full range. So they complement each other, but they are different. And often our priority sites are already identified as significant natural areas,
Yeah.
but so there is an overlap.
Yeah, that's what I'm really interested in, the degree of overlap, you know, whether you have any figures about that?
Look, we are in the process of further refining our mapping of those priority sites that I showed you. So I'll be in a better position to be able to tell you that later in the year, but yeah, I couldn't tell you the number right at the moment.
Yeah, well, thanks through the chair. That's really great. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. Yeah, thank you. Really comprehensive report there, Natasha. I'd just like to briefly jump back to the Coastcare side of it. I did go around the East Coast on Wednesday with the TCDC, just looking at the various sites and that sort of thing. And it was amazing to see the work that went in at Pawanui and yeah, how many plants they got planted in sort of 3 hours over 2 days. So pretty cool. And obviously the blessing in the Pawanui side is that there is quite a setback from the houses and just a point really. It's what we've got to think about is the conflict that we're getting when there is very little dune zone between that and the private land and that sort of thing. And I do think we need to consider hard structures more as a bit of an option. I know we don't like them in the coastal zone, but it is something, you know, you get further north, Wharekau and stuff like that, and that they're right onto and into the boundaries of those private properties. So the push-ups we keep doing just keeps getting washed away all the time. Just a point really, but thanks for the report. Excellent. Thanks, Chair.
Stu?
Yeah, thanks. I was actually going to talk about the total Paru wetland, but just on that one, to me, that photo they showed of that Pawanui site just showed the foolishness of past planning decisions as to how close those properties are. And acknowledging I don't live there, I'm not convinced that hard structures are the long-term solution. Yeah, but anyway, it's a hard one, no matter how we look at it. But Natasha, I found the Toriparu one really fascinating, and looking at all those, almost all the pink lines are the individual land titles, are they?
They are not necessarily a property boundary, but a title.
Yeah. Look, it's quite a complex scenario, isn't it? And I guess my question is, have you found you've been able to get enough like-minded landowners and people that are together to try and form a really long-term plan? And I guess where I'm going is it would be really frustrating. Yeah, they're quite complicated boundaries and they're not easy fence lines. And it would be so frustrating if an individual landowner decided to, grow a whole lot of carbon forest or something, which would really undo the intent of what we're trying to do there. And I suppose the other one is looking forward in some of this sort of country, one has to wonder whether pastoral agriculture is still going to be the long-term land use, and it would again be quite frustrating to have spent a whole bunch of money on fencing and then find that down the track, or even 20 years down the track, if we're able with a collective impact approach to try and support these landowners to get more restoration on some of that pastoral land that's pretty marginal as well. So I guess my question is, are you finding you can get a big enough picture overview in terms of long-term planning for what's best for these sort of sites?
Look, that's what we're attempting to do through this program. And look, I know that the landowners in this area are exploring further options. There's been several, as I said, land care researcher involved, Manaki Whenua, and they are a reasonably connected group. And I know that they are keen to get more funding. But you're right, that is the challenge of how we connect individual landowners, other community groups for that wider catchment management, essentially. So yeah, absolutely.
I mean, there's awesome opportunity there, just even for looking at this aerial photo. So yes, it's good you guys are working there. Thanks.
And you're right about the change in land use. There are some incentives driving the planting of things like plants, and there's a lot of concerns across all sectors and different reasons for that. And that is allowed. That's the landowners can do. So at the moment we work in the encouraging space and protecting what we have got, but it is landowners' prerogative, obviously.
Yeah. Cool. Thanks.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
So the coastal and Biodiversity Site Program of Integrated Catchment Committee of 23 May 2023 be received. Bruce and Michael, thank you. All in favour? Resilience and
All right, Mr. Chairman, so I welcome Rick Lefting. So I didn't introduce Rick before, he came in after initial introduction. So Rick Lefting, our team leader, Regional Resilience. Rick will give a quick snapshot of the overall Regional Resilience and Emergency Management Program before a bit of a dive into the summer that we'd all like to forget. One thing I'd note is that Rick will certainly focus on some of the broader issues in terms of what we saw during the event, the kind of catchment conditions that we've seen persisting. But you would have picked up that there's a bit of a theme of storm impacts through our preceding papers as well around flood management, river management and catch management. So we'll cover that off through those respective papers. Thanks, Rick.
Morning, everyone. So yeah, next slide, please. So I just want to give a quick overview of the resilient development and emergency management activities that are run through the regional resilience team primarily. Just want to point out that those are the two bullet points there of both of those two activities, is that these are not just ICM focused activities. These actually run across all of the organisation and across the region as well. And so they are quite broad. And the resilient development is really to make sure that regional council has and provides guidance and leadership, essentially to make sure people aren't building in silly places, and to help guide our territorial authority partners in terms of information to make good decisions. The emergency management activity is to look at, to basically ensure that WRC is response ready and capable at all times. So as we've seen this year, we have a number of weather-related events, but it could be anything, any type of non-BAU emergency that WRC has legislative objectives to actually respond to, such as marine oil spill, biosecurity events as well, and also supporting our civil defence partners during any other type of event or activity. Happy to provide any questions on that now, just in terms of what we do and why we do it, and then I can move on. Next slide, please. So a quick snapshot. I'll take, if I can, through the chair, the report is being read. Next slide, please. So just a quick summary there in terms of the emergency response budgets are, as you can see, they're way over budget. And again, that is because it's very hard to budget events during the year. So all of that increase is primarily through labour budgets and the response that Regional Council has done from staff, both directly for the weather events for WRC business, but also to support our civil defence colleagues as well. So that's why that is over budget. And because we've had all the staff responding to these events, we're now underspent on our resilient development because we haven't had the resources to continue our BAU. That BAU had to be put to the side and for us to continue with the response. And we're slowly getting into that, back into that BAU workload at the moment.
Yeah, just a quick question, Rick, and I know Pam's raised it with Minister Woods and that sort of thing, but is there anything on the horizon from central government? For repairs to the soft infrastructure and stuff like that. I mean, I know they're working hard on roads, etc., and a bridge for us, but is there anything you've heard that's coming down the chain that
there is a lot of funding out there? I think we're still working on a process to identify how we can access that funding and what we need to do to access that.
Thank you.
Mr. Chair, that was essentially my question well, it was twofold. One is, can you take councillors through how we cover that over expenditure, what budgets that comes out of, and what is that process, just so councillors are aware. And secondly, it's just to back up that I do hope we are actively exploring every opportunity to tap into the cyclone recovery funding that central government has offered to cover it instead the ratepayer bucket?
Sure. If I can maybe talk about the specific impacts from the weather events and how they will be paid for in the next item, if that's okay. And Greg might want to be able to help out with some of that explanation as well. In terms of the labour budget that you see there and which budgets it come from, I mean, it's like internal labour budget. So someone is working on the response, then they're not doing work somewhere else. And so it's a bit of, you know, rob Peter to pay Paul, for instance. So it's allocated to this budget, but somewhere else in the organisation, some of those labour budgets will be down because they've been to come through here. So the labour budgets are sort of almost neutral across the organisation. But it just means that it does have impact on other parts of the businesses, business as usual.
Tipper.
Kia ora. Thank you for the report, Rick. Just a couple of things and taking on learning. We used to plan for the 1 in 100 event. Now, resilience is the response, you know, having these active plans. I'm just wondering if we've made the shift in our thinking, just overall about how we plan for the more likely extreme weather events. Because before, when I got here, it was a pretty, you know, we were up for 1 in 5, but you know, that's all moved in the 9 years. So just have we shifted? And as a result of what we've learned, how are we resourcing communities that will always end up remote, like the Coromandel? Just, yeah, roads will fall out, and how do we make sure they've got everything they need there, whether it's sat links, whatever, so that they're more resilient going forward, or whether they're out the back blocks of Taharoa or something. I don't know, but there's always going to be remoteness in our region, and how we're considering that in our new approach, because I would think what we used to do isn't enough anymore.
Yeah, really
My
good.
sense of things,
Yeah,
but yeah.
through the chair, really good questions. I think we just need to be quite clear around our roles and responsibilities, and we're, in terms of the impact on communities, that's a civil defence role. So we have really good processes through local community response plans run through local civil defence through the representative territorial authorities, and then we have our and then through our group civil defence as well to provide that coordinating role. Regional Council provides intel and information to those CDM groups to then feed through to the communities as well. So we do have some good processes in place there, but it is the communities to really needing to understand how things are changing, and we can provide information around how that is changing. As an example of how things have, in terms of the weather events, I started here in 2013. We didn't have a flood or a significant flood until 2017. And then it's been, we've gotten very good practice in flood events since then. So things are changing, and that's one of the other aspects I was going to mention in my next report around the thresholds have now changed, particularly now in terms of when we start seeing impacts from rain events. They are coming down a lot lower, and I might explain that in the next. That's okay.
Here on picture.
That's in this item here, so I can go straight into the next item if that's fine. So next slide, please.
Oh, sorry.
Yep.
All right, sorry. Thank you. And a second. Yep. All in favour?
Okay, so now we have a bit of a deep dive into summer storms. As I said, we will be covering some of these elements off in terms of work program impacts in our next papers as well. So we'll see where the best placed position for some questions I'm sure you'll have will lie. Thanks, Rick.
Okay, I'll just wait for the slides coming. Now, some of you may have seen some of these slides previously, and again, I'll take the report as read and really just showing and emphasising on what we had, where we are now, and what we may see in the near future as well. So just a quick summary, we had 3 significant events very, very close to each other, so compounding impacts. And you can see we had Cyclone Hale at the start of January, the Auckland anniversary floods, and then Cyclone Gabriel to cap it all off. And since then, we've also had some other weather events since then as well, even just over this weekend. And the west coast of our region on the coastline had quite a significant coastal event as well. So it's not just rain, it's also our coastal hazards as well. I just wanted to give that overview for a start. So next slide, please. So while we had these three compounding events, I just wanted to show how that looks. So what you'll see there are two images, and we had really good intel from GNS sites who provided this information here. So this is rainfall-induced landslide probability. So what they have been able to do is to take the geology, taking the ground elevations, the slopes, and the contributing factors to land instability, and understand where and how intense the rain fell during, and this is Cyclone Gabrielle, and putting in a probability of the likelihood of a landslide occurring. So the image on the left there is the higher probability. So it's more likely to for a landslide to occur probabilistically in that area. If we go a little bit, and that was at the start of the cyclone event. As we went through the cyclone event, we had more rain falling, and that's represented in that image on the right. So as we had more rain falling, and GNS were able to track where that rain fell, you were able to understand, well, where are the most susceptible areas of land instability. So that's where it was deemed to be a high probability. Now, if you widen that probability to say, okay, well let's see what does it look like if the rain thresholds are a little bit lower, the catchments are more susceptible, for instance, and what would the probability be if you widen those that range out? Next slide, please. And so if you widen that probability out, you can see that the landslide susceptibility covers the majority of the Coromandel Peninsula. And that's what we have at the moment in terms of the rain thresholds reducing in terms of the impacts on our catchments. So you can see that for the Coromandel Peninsula, potentially quite significant land instability issues, which we're seeing already. Next slide, please. Here's just a couple of images of flood extents, and you see the Apara and Te Araha. Again, this is Cyclone Gabrielle. And again, I just wanted to show the potential impacts of just rainfall on our already saturated catchments. Next slide, please. And just wanted to focus in on the no, it's not, oh, there it is. So on the flood barrier that we have over State Highway 26 and how important that is for community resilience of a flooding event on the Ahunamuri River. Now, this is after the peak. So the flood extent was actually higher than this. We were able to fly straight after Cyclone Gabrielle, pretty much the next day, to get these shots, which are really, really quite important to understand those impacts. Next slide, please. Look, to summarise where we are, it's very wet out there, and that is I downloaded this yesterday, and this is available publicly on our environmental data hub, so anyone can look at these stats from all of our rain gauges. This one here is the Pinnacles rain gauge, which is within the Karonga River catchment, and you can see that the 100% line there, and the months from mid last year and into this year, and the rainfall above 100% average rainfall, historical rainfall for those months. So you can see from July towards the end of last year, we had a significant amount of rain, more than normal. So even before we had these events in January and February, our catchments were already quite saturated. And then we have a compounding impact of successive events. Next page, next slide, please. Some of you may have seen these. This is, again, downloaded this yesterday. This is, again, for the Karonga catchment and the Pinnacles rain gauge. We've already exceeded our average annual amount of rainfall at that site. Next slide, please. And it's a very similar situation for other parts of our region as well. So this is on our west coast, and you can see that for parts of this year, we had exceeded the historic maximums, and we're now near historic maximums and at least above the 95 percentile. Next slide, please. And similarly here in the lower Waikato at Whangamarino, again, start of the year, unprecedented highest than ever recorded rainfall amounts, and we're still tracking above the 95 percentile amounts for the lower Waikato as well. Next slide, please. So that gives a bit of a longer term view. Now this again is for the Coromandel Peninsula as a whole, and this is a graph that shows from I think that July last year the rainfall events and the impact on our catchment. So this is the antecedent precipitation index, or the API. Just gives an idea of how wet and how saturated our catchments are. And what of note is how close these events are where our catchments are at extreme saturation. And every event that you have changes the catchment dynamics. Right, and so the successive event changes the game. With the goalposts have changed because the catchments have changed. With the geology and the saturation, things are moving, and so the next event has a certain amount of uncertainty in terms of what those impacts may be. Next slide, please. So what that means is, and this was alluded to before, was the game has changed, and we now are uncertain in terms of what our rainfall frequencies are and what the impacts are likely to occur from a particular size of event. So what we have been able to do in the past is to correlate a particular ARI, an average return interval event of rainfall, such as this is a 20-year return interval event, and we would be able to a certain extent, expect the likely damage or impact from that event. But that's now changed. And so because of our very saturated catchments, the fact that each successive event changes our catchments, we are seeing larger impacts from lower thresholds, lower rainfall events. And that's likely to continue for the remainder of this winter season and perhaps beyond as well. Next slide, please. This is an image from NIWA, and again, just to guide you through those images. So the middle image there is the soil moisture deficit or excess at this time last year. You can see that I downloaded these yesterday, so from the 21st. And you can see for the Hauraki Plains and for most of the Waikato is that we were in deficit this time last year. The image on the left is the historical average, and the most pertinent image is the one on the right, which is our deficit. Well, it's not really a deficit, it's in excess. So the majority of the Waikato region is at field capacity. Our catchments are saturated, and in some cases it's water surplus, so we're oversaturated in those areas. Next slide, please. So what does that mean for the rest of this year? Well, NIWA has produced a seasonal outlook out to, I think, July, this one goes out to. And if you look at that bottom right-hand image there, which is our forecast rainfall, which is above or normal rainfall. So again, it suggests that we are still going to have a wet winter. And again, the impacts from this wet winter are still a little bit uncertain in terms of how our catchments will perform and what impacts we might see. So it's very much a waiting game in terms of just keeping an eye on what events are coming, being well prepared, informing our communities about what these impacts might be. And if you've been keeping a track of our Flood Room Live, we have kept Flood Room Live, which is our key communication portal for rain events and flooding impacts. And that has been in monitoring phase for quite a while. And we're having these successive rainfall events, even if they may not be a heavy rain warning. The rain watches are something of concern, and even the thunderstorms that we get through that don't have a watch are still of concern as well for particular areas. So I understand that at the next council meeting that there will be a request for access to further reserves for funding for some of these impacts, and Greg may want to comment on that for this in terms of what the next steps are in terms of remediation and recovery of our catchments. But that's me, and thank you very much.
Questions? Oh, sorry.
I'm just reflecting on the, above normal forecasts and the fully saturated soils and the vulnerability of the Coromandel. Sorry about that, Warren. Just wondering what sort of forward planning, if any, what sort of communication? I understand the flood room being in monitoring and things like that, but is there any other avenues we explore to ensure that our communities are prepared? Anything?
Again, we go back to the impact from a natural hazard on people and place, and that's a civil defence key responsibility and role. So we work.
I understand it sits with civil defense. I'm just wondering, as an organization, how are we working in with civil defense to ensure that our communities are prepared?
Yeah, we're guided by civil defence in terms of what requirements they need, and certainly one of the key ones that we do is to provide that heads up on particular events that we need to alert civil defence, and then they go through to their communities in terms of ensuring that they are prepared. So we are guided by civil defence, and we are working very closely with them in terms of providing information that they require to inform their communities. And it is about resilience. So we are also working closely with Waka Kotahi, and we're about to start a series of workshops to look at work resilience and what that might look like as well. So definitely it's a very challenging space at the moment, and all we can at this stage, we're guided by civil defence in terms of what we can provide and continue our work in terms of keeping a track on what the weather is looking to do and what impact that might have.
Thank you, Pamela. I'd just like to add into that just for a second that I think where Pamela's coming from, I'm not talking for her, but I think some of us are in that state of emergency all the time and we haven't actually come out of it. And I think that's what she was trying to explain, that civil defence needs to know that some of us are in this situation and it's not changing at all. Like my farm itself, I'm just wet and it's wet and it's wet and it just doesn't want to go away. So every event is an event at the moment. So big or small, it just doesn't seem to want to go away. So yeah, that's anyway.
I'll just jump in before I think Clyde was next, but yeah, and I think following on from what Pam said, Patrick, it's just I think resilience for our staff too. Yeah. Because as you point out, you look back to November, we're now just about in June, and the workloads, we've got to be really conscious of what's going on in our field offices, etc., with the staff resilience.
So yeah, just through the chair. So we have initiated what's called, we're utilising our emergency response framework, and we had a meeting last week with what's called an emergency triage team. So that's having some subject matter experts come in, have a bit of a think, and the key component to that was how will these floods or how will these potentially future impacts impact our upcoming business as usual as an organisation and staff welfare as well. So we're going through that and looking to initiate an IMT, incident management team, to look at that impact on our business. So while we have a very good response in terms of the weather and the impacts, this is a separate IMT around what's coming at us from an organisation. So we're looking to set that up very shortly.
Thank you for the clarity. What?
Could you see that these the slides are shared with us, please?
Yeah, thanks for that, Rick. I'm just interested because you've obviously been talking to NIWA and you've got the forecast for the rest of the winter. I'm reflecting back on the draft SOE that we received the other day, which talked about the declining water, reduced water, because it presented decadal information. And we are now 3 years into that new decade, if you like, and the amounts that we're seeing now are amounts that potentially will affect the decadal average. They're so large, you know, they're massive. I heard some people in Mercury discussing this exact same point the other day. And so, I mean, what is NIWA saying about next year and the year after? That's the bit, it's like the $1 million question, because people haven't got out of emergency situation now. And the question is, yeah, knowing the way climate change works, but are NIWA or anybody saying anything about the next 2 or 3 years? I mean, is this some sort of tipping point where it's a new normal?
Very, very good question. And in fact, I did listen to an article on the news last night around that very question in terms of what do we have going for us over the next perhaps 2, 3, 4, 5 years. And ultimately the question is not sure. We can't look out that far with any certainty. Sorry, can you hear me? If that soil moisture image that I showed before and where we were this time last year, no one last year was saying that we will be in this position this year. And so that's again where climate change is starting to potentially start to getting those impacts from projected climate change influences, where we are getting these extremes coming through. So the extremes are getting more intense and more frequent. So some parts of our year we have too much rain, other parts of the year we don't have enough. So at the end of last year, we actually set up a drought IMT. That got stopped pretty quickly. So and we moved into more flood response. So again, trying to predict or forecast even out over a year is extremely difficult.
Yeah, but basically you're in constant contact with NIWA and people. I mean,
we do rely on the work that NIWA does, such as these seasonal outlooks. Yeah. Even these seasonal outlooks, they're still in some ways a bit of a bet each way in terms of what we are likely to get. So it's very hard to plan specifically for even these seasonal outlooks and looking out 3 or 4 months. With the forecast information that we have, we struggle to look at to have a reasonable amount of certainty 10 days out. It's not until we are potentially 2 or 3 days out do we actually have a clear picture of actually what's going to hit us. So it's New Zealand is a very, very tricky country to predict weather short and longer term as well. So it's quite a challenge, but we need to manage that uncertainty the best we can and take a precautionary approach. Understanding our antecedent conditions is a big part of that, and we can see that we are fragile and vulnerable at the moment, so that does not bode well for the next few months.
Oh, no, so again, I'm keen to acknowledge your team for everything, all the work already done, and ask again, have we got enough resources at the time when you need them to deploy around these events, so that we're not loading up people who already carry a huge responsibility for us, as one. But the other one is, if we can't predict the weather, we can predict our vulnerabilities, right? Those maps that show we were prone to different activities. But I think the public now expects that if, when asked, that we did everything we could. Okay, so we're saying, have we done everything we can? And if there's more, can you tell us what that might be? Because if I was an Auckland ratepayer, I'll be in the opposite situation, right? Going, gee, I hope someone's looking out for us. But we want to be that council that at least if we can't predict the weather, we can predict where we might be vulnerable. I remember we had this talk, Greg, if people knew what Waikato does for us in a flood, then they may feel a bit greater sense of, I don't know, security or something like that, because, climate anxiety is real for some sectors of the population. maybe if you're sitting there looking at the water rise, Oa. So what I'm trying to say is if I just need assurance that by your count and our count, we're doing everything we can to prepare, model, run exercises, be able to staff up at the right times and deploy those resources easily, and that it's nothing that we're stopping from happening. I know it's a big ask, but.
Yeah, look, resourcing is a real challenge in this kind of space because obviously we've got a business as usual program that traditionally happens over the summer. That's been interrupted significantly. We've had a whole stack of new work coming in. We've got constant inquiries coming in from the community as well around additional work that needs to happen. It's a active conversation that's happening at the moment around how do we actually resource and how do we prioritise what needs to be done. The actual recovery from these particular events, it's going to be multi-year. It's going to take a while, and we need to identify, how do we actually prioritise what needs to happen now? What can we do within the current resources versus what do we need to look at multi-years? What do we need to look at through other funding sources as well? I can dive into the government side of things later on in the flood protection program if you like. But there's also looking at our disaster reserves. How do we best utilise those? The other challenge for us as an organisation is I think, as Rick's alluded to, is we do have a responsibility in these emergency management situations across a number of functions, and how do we make sure that we have trained folk ready to go? And I think it's fair to say at the moment we do need more. We have an active program at the moment for getting people trained, but certainly more is needed. Yeah, and look, I mean, it also speaks to the concept of a civil defence group. Civil defence isn't just one council; it's a number of councils. It's Lifeline Utilities, it's welfare organisations, and it's how does that group pull together during times like this. The other aspect is around just getting some correct messaging out around the fact that we couldn't be in for a hell of a winter, and now's the time to actually think ahead around getting prepared, making sure that we're resting when there's time for rest, and making sure that we understand where our vulnerabilities are, so that when the flag does go up, we're in a much better position to respond.
Yeah, no, thanks, Greg, because it kind of feels to me like the cost of BAU is actually going up, and rather than looking for where we can prioritise other things, we probably need to think about the overall BAU resourcing as well,
Benjamin, question?
Yeah, I was just asking about whether it's worthwhile putting some publicity out about these graphs. If we are looking at more wet weather coming this winter, can we let people know? Because forecast rainfall, the graphs are quite significant.
And just in response to that, I think that's a great follow-up from this meeting.
No,
actually, my point's probably just on what Ben's raised. Insofar as last week I was reading the Farmers Weekly, which seems to be the predominant magazine in the rural community. And it was an article on the extended La Nina that we've had and moving to the El Nino, and the conflict that's happening between NIWA and the Met Service, and NIWA using more American technology and terms like atmospheric river and the likes, emotive terms, where I think the Met Service, if I recall correctly, was more on the British technology. And the article highlighted the difference in outlook between both organisations, and NIWA wasn't in this space. It's set up as a Crown Research and has moved into weather predictions and whatever. And of course, Met Service is upset about them moving to their space. So that, putting that little issue aside, my concern would be, are we relying solely on NIWA, or are we looking at all valid sources of information to make our own predictions going forward?
Thank you, through the chair. So Met Service is New Zealand's official severe weather forecaster, full stop. So we get all of our official information from Met Service, and they do a very good job in providing us with the weather watches, the warnings. We are on the phone to them every weather event, and they actually ring us every time they do issue a severe weather alert. So we work very closely with the Met Service. We utilise NIWA more around the seasonal outlooks and that longer climate information. NIWA, and I agree, it's a crowded area in terms of weather forecasting with NIWA and Met Service, and it can cause some issues. And I have pushed back to NIWA in terms of, hey, look, this is information that isn't helpful because we need to be utilising that one source of truth, which is Met Service, our official forecaster. All of our model information comes from Met Service. They provide us that information. We have a contract with Met Service. But we do ensure that we are not just looking within Met Service, we look at other weather sources as well. And one thing to be aware of is that with the global models that Met Service use and NIWA use, they are essentially the same models. They're just shown slightly differently. And NIWA might have some better marketing and show things nicer, but essentially they are the same information. They generally do say the same things. We also utilise other public services such as Windy TV, Met BUW as well, just to make sure that we're on the same page. But there's only 3 or 4 main global models that all of the weather providers actually use. So there's a lot of commonality there. Again, we have we manage uncertainty, and it's the uncertainty in the forecasting that is key to us and how we manage that.
I can just say you made a point earlier in the presentation about being here since 2013. I've been around here a bit longer, and we had the 98 event, which was the first really big one since 58. And that was an appalling response, and I said so at the time as a member of the Drainage Committee. However, since then, with 2004, 2008, 2012, and the rest of them that have followed, but there was a gap there after 2012. These systems have got better. The earthquakes and disasters have brought the systems with emergency management. So sadly, with the events that have happened, we have actually gained from that and better all round. So yeah, I think the response and planning is far better than it was 20 odd years ago. Thank you.
And through the chair, and also replying to another comment from Councillor Mahuta, is from our regional resilience team and the work that we do in that flood response space, is that we are continually improving. And so we watch the space actually in terms of some more work where we are to provide some better situational awareness, working closely with Met Service around where rain is falling, how much, and that relative aspect is this a 5-year event, a 10-year, 20-year, 50-year event. So watch the space on that one. And that, again, is working closely with Met Service and some of the new services that you'll see soon. And we are working with Met Service on a pilot project using, it's called HydroNet, to bring both our internal information and Met Service information together to gain, again, even more or better situational awareness and forecasting going forward as well.
Thank you. Thank you, Rick. I'd just like to say thanks very much for the effort that your team's put in for the last 6 months that I've been on council, because I've definitely got a lot of emails from you guys in that time of weather events going through the whole Waikato region, just not my own. So yeah, you've put in, and as I said the other day, I was upstairs in another meeting. I was actually watching you guys, what was going on with the weather, and you're all grouping there and deciding what was going on. Is quite interesting. You're sitting back from a distance watching. So thank you for your efforts. Cheers.
I appreciate that, and it's very much a team effort, and we have weather responders from across the organisation, not just within ICM as well. So it's thank you.
Thank you. So I'd like to recommend the severe weather event summer of 2023 be received. Stu and Tipper, all in favour? Thank you.
Thanks, Rick. And now we'll move on to refocus on our flood protection land drainage activities. So I'll welcome Adam Munro, our Manager Flood Protection Land Drainage, and David Wade, our Manager Business Technical Services, to do a bit of a joint effort on giving you an update on this activity. And you will certainly see that sprinkled throughout the report will be stuff around storms.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. Mr. Chairman, and yeah, Morena Koto councillors. So Dave and I will do a bit of a tag team approach, give you a bit of an overview of the flood protection land drainage report. We will take the report as read, and just by way of some introductory comments, just to set the scene, I'll then hand over to Dave to run through some slides. If you recall, we had a workshop earlier this year just to present the overview of how ICM is structured around our 8 management zones. This report draws together the flood protection land drainage activities across the entire region. We quite often, when we think of flood protection, we think of Waihao, Piako and Lower Waikato, but it also includes the Coromandel, Taupo and other zones as well. So just wanted to acknowledge those. While they are smaller schemes, they are still quite important in providing community protection. Also would like to acknowledge the zone managers have contributed to this report as well, who are online today, I think, just to support any questions that might arise. And they do all the hard yards, of course, behind the scenes. And so just want to acknowledge their contribution to what you see before you today. Yeah, I guess it's a bit of a common theme going to run through today's meeting around weather. And I guess the flood protection land drainage report is no exception. Just wanted to just say that, it has been a challenging year. We've had to reforecast, reprioritise work as the storms have unfolded. I won't go into any great detail in respect to individual projects, but you'll see a range of capital projects listed on page 63, 66 of your report, and happy to take any questions, Mr. Chairman, at the end on any of those. But fair to say that a lot of our progress on our capital and operational programs have been impacted by weather and also recruitment challenges as well. And I think the team's done a great job to re-look at that as we've gone through this year. But in saying that, and Dave will show some slides shortly, we're actually still able to press on with a pretty big program and deliver on some BAU work, which is nice to know as well. Just in respect to budgets, so just across the activity, you'll see that the flood protection budgets have been overspent, particularly in the Lower Waikato, Waihao, Piako zones. And that's primarily because of obviously the storm damage that we've got, and we are collating information, and it's still coming in from landowners and also from the operational teams in respect to some of the damage that's been done to the schemes, and we will report back on that through a disaster recovery report at a later date, potentially the next meeting. So also just to say that some of those costs will be covered potentially by the disaster reserve, and we will be working that through with our financial accountant, James, and also through just our policy. And so the council does have a policy in this respect. Just a reminder that the disaster recovery is based on a return period. So we have an operational program. Anything around that 5-year event is covered by operational budget. A 10-year plus event, we have a local disaster recovery, and then the big events is covered by a regional reserve, which all the zones pay into, but more will be presented on the disaster reserve policy in due course. We cannot forget also land drainage, and while it might be regarded as a poorer cousin of flood protection, it does still provide a very valuable service to a lot of our pastoral community, and it's fair to say that the land drainage areas have been under a lot of pressure with a lot of water, a lot of high water tables, and our inability to press on with our spray program and our mechanical cleaning, largely due to the weather. We can't spray when it's windy, but we also can't go on land or alongside our drains because the ground is too soft. And so we're unable to get diggers and excavators, utes even are too heavy for the ground conditions. So we're just having to manage that as we go forward too. So I just wanted to also just, and you, Greg, Rick mentioned it before, overall the flood schemes have performed very well. You will see that given the amount of rain that we've had, the extent of flooding, the flood schemes, is testament to all the hard work that's gone into it, not only from the designers back in the day, but also to our operational and catchment teams that have been running around like headless chickens for the last few months. So just wanted to acknowledge their contribution as well. So I'll hand over to Dave to run us through some pictures. Thanks, Dave.
Yeah, thanks, Alan. Morena, this is my first council meeting, so be patient. Yeah, I just want to say thanks, first of all. you acknowledged the hard work the teams have done. It was one of my first comments, actually, that our teams have been extremely resilient and continue to be under some pressure, as the weather systems continue to hammer New Zealand. So what I'll talk about a little bit is the impact on capital program and also the impact on some of the asset conditions that we're seeing. I think it's worth also mentioning the earthquake events. So we've talked a lot about the storm damage, the impact of that, but we've not really talked about earthquake. And our workload commenced very quickly into the new year with the quake events over in Te Aroha. And I suspect some of our observations in the conditions of the assets are really partially based on some of the damage that we incurred during those events. As Adam said, the scheme stood up well. On inspection this year, we've managed to achieve most of the inspections, and I'll cover the details later. The condition of the assets is really exemplary given the age and general condition. They could have fared a lot worse. Having said that, the river and catchment areas have probably not fared so well, and I'll let others talk about that later. So as Adam mentioned, the ongoing focus really is on remedial work, and also to try and continue with some of the capital works as best we can. Next slide, please. You have in your reports the details of the capital program. There were a number of project impacts, I guess, that affected how we have delivered the capital works this year. Not just the weather, we've had some challenges with the projects themselves in terms of design, and also just general delays and knock-on effects because of discovered issues, I guess. So in terms of the impact, probably the next slide will probably give us a better view. The focus for me really this year is on managing the fallout from the capital works that weren't complete. We're now reprogramming the rest of this work that isn't complete into next year. So I'm in the process of that and hope to complete that by the end of June. Next slide, please. So we started the season with an annual plan of 31 million, there or thereabouts. As you can see from our forecasts, we're looking at about 17.5 million spend, so there will be a carryover there of about 14.8 million. Now, clearly, one of the conversations we're having is about how much we can cope with. So part of my considerations for the coming annual plan is, do we need what was in the annual plan for next year of 12.9 million? Be able to answer that question probably later in the season. So, yeah, just to reinforce the point, we will be considering how much work we've already got, which didn't get completed this year, before we add more to it.
So can I just ask on that? So essentially acknowledging that we aren't completing work. So for the LTP, which, because we've done the annual plan for this year, so the LTP, you'll look at rescheduling, restaging the work so that we're not carrying forward all the time. We'll actually look at a work program that basically starts afresh.
Essentially, yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Achievable goals.
That makes a lot of sense, but I'm assuming that a lot of these work programs were planned because they were necessary, because we don't throw money around. So I'd like to also see if rationalise this work program, what's falling off, and is it safe for that to fall off?
Yeah, absolutely. Good.
And make sure we're not creating a bow wave of stuff ahead of us,
Absolutely. I guess when we look at the capital program, we've got three categories. We've got the shovel-ready program, we've got capital new works, and then we've got remedial work, which came from structural audit. So we have to prioritise the structural audit findings, in my view. Yep. Next slide, please. The good news really is we managed to complete most of our structural audits. Structural audit, for information, is a very detailed asset inspection where we have to dewater the site, make it safe. There's a lot of equipment and contractors required on the day, a multi-organisational effort, and we employ some of the best condition assessment techniques. That is quite a lengthy process, and given the weather conditions that we've seen recently, I'm pleased to report that we've completed nearly 100% of that work. There's one exception, Kaihiri Floodgate and Pump Station, which wasn't completed. That has been rescheduled, and there are 5 lower Waikato floodgates that still require inspections. General condition inspections we can carry out without the dewatering process, which makes it quicker and cheaper. We've completed 100% of floodgates and pump stations, and we've also completed about 71% of stop banks and spillways. So again, we've rescheduled most of the remaining. Next slide, please. Some pictures here just illustrate the dewatering. Obviously, to really understand the condition of our assets, we need to make the site safe and dry. That has been a challenge, of course. This is quite an expensive and lengthy process, so has to be well planned. It was fortunate we got onto this very early in the season, so we managed to make those inspections complete. Next slide, please. Just to give you an illustration of some of the things that we are seeing, and I'm sure you may have seen these before, we've got aged structures, concrete, predominantly with rebar for reinforcement, and we can continue to extend the life through, minor repairs. There's an example of a typical repair that we've carried out this year. That was on the Georges Floodgate. Next slide. As you can see here from the CCTV footage, we have some issues with some of our submerged structures, such as pipes. And in this particular example, we've got a drop of about 200 millimeter, 100 millimeters. Those are the typical issues that we won't be able to fix during the inspection process. So we now need to schedule that work for the next season. Next slide, please. Again, talking about age of our assets, we've got a number of older structures with obsolete construction methods. This one has an aluminium pipe, which is encased in concrete. And you can see there, I'm not sure the picture is very clear for you, but the degradation of that pipe is pretty much, it's completely eroded or corroded, and now we've got risk of the concrete structure suffering as a result of high water flow. These again are major works that we will need to plan and schedule. Next slide.
Yeah, so this is just an example of some of the damage we received on the Waihau Valley scheme. This is the come out of North Floodgate. It collapsed during Cyclone Gabrielle, and you can see the scour that it left, and so we had to replace that pipe and put a new headwall in pretty quickly, because that was a key link for the catchment into the river. So that was done under urgency. So, but that was a great result, and we'll report on a bit later in the disaster report that will come to council in due course.
Next slide, please. This one really just shows the catastrophic failure of one of our structures. And in the previous slides, you saw some lining options there, and these kinds of problems we're seeing quite frequently now with the age of some of our assets. Again, this one will be scheduled for complete replacement. Next slide, please.
So just on that, it looks to me like most of these schemes were done at a certain period in time. And like you're doing the inspections, but the reality is in a short period of time, it seems to me that a lot of the assets will need replacement or certainly major works on them. So are we factoring that into budgets? There's going to be, it's not going to be a linear, we'll do one at a time over X years. It's going to be multiple ones in a short space of time. Are we budgeting for that sort of issue? Yeah, over here for the shop that's coming.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, our budgets have to be based around what's affordable and priorities, but also what capacities we have. We know with contractor capacities in the region, there are some challenges in getting the work done that we need to get done. That's something I can come back to you on.
And if I could,
The concern for me, if I can, would be that something that we're going to put off for a year or two has a catastrophic collapse and has great impact on communities. At what cost do we not do something? Is it the potential that could happen if we don't? Or is there some risk that we're prepared to take? And I'm not sure the community would ask for a lot of risk at the moment.
yeah, so I mean, and if I might, through you, Mr. Chairman, we have a range of information that we know about our assets. So obviously we've seen some of the here and now that we have from the various inspections. We know how old they are. We know expected lifetimes. So we've got some degree to be able to anticipate that future work program over a number of years. And that's what we'll be bringing through the long-term plan, and obviously bring that balance between affordability, but obviously making sure that we're managing the risk appropriately, because we certainly don't want to be trading off the resilience of the community if we simply need to get work done. We'll be absolutely upfront about that.
Yeah, thanks, Greg. To you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, so that's a really good question for leading into this next slide. So this is the Lake Waikare refurbishment project. Sarah is obviously quite heavily involved in this with the team and working with Dave's team as well in the engineering. So this gate, just from just a bit of background, is a key community asset gate. It helps us control the level of Lake Waikare. We have consented conditions for that. Lake Waikare acts as a flood control storage area for the Waikato River. So when the river gets up to a certain height, it overflows the Rangitiriri spillway into the lake, and then it flows out through the Whangamarino wetland and then back into the Waikato River down through the Whangamarino control gate. So a good question around the design life of our assets and how we triage. So this came ahead earlier than what we expected, but given the risks, given the I guess our level of service, we had to expedite this gate replacement. Unfortunately, it was delayed due to earlier weather events, and the idea was to replace it over the summertime when lake level is supposed to be low and rainfall is supposed to be droughty. So we can say that we work quite closely with our contractors. We extracted the gate. It's gone off to Te Aroha, to Cullen's Engineering, and has been refabricated and will be reinstalled this week. So we're expecting that to be Thursday, Friday, hopefully earlier. So it's been a great outcome, and hats off to Sarah and team for working with the contractors and getting this gate replaced and refurbished in quick time, recognising its risk. And at the moment, we've got a very high lake level, so there'll be a lot of relieved landowners around that lake looking forward to bringing those levels down. Thank you.
I think that's all we've got to cover.
I just wanted to, before we end the report, Mr. Chairman, just want to acknowledge that this report also embeds the Shovel Ready program of work too, and just acknowledging the work that Julie and her team have put into a lot of the asset upgrades as well through the provision of government money. And so it's, what you see before you today has been a total package. So thank you.
Any questions? I'd definitely like to say one anyway, but more dealing with land drainage. I think that's going to be a real issue over the next 12 months because the spray program hasn't been completed, and there's going to be a lot more mechanical cleaning over the next 12 months to catch up on where the weed issue we've got in drains. I was at a farm meeting last night in Springdale, and it was a big issue just in the Thames Valley. So, and I imagine Lower Waikato is no different, and the other catchments as well. So, I think a lot of thought's got to go into that, and
Yes, through you, Mr. Chairman, if I may. So we staff are giving quite a lot of thought into the strategic approach for land drainage moving forward, and we do have a lot of marginal land out there at the moment, subjected to quite a lot of waterlogging, high water tables, and peat settlement, which is causing a lot of, vertical land changes, and that's something that we're going to have to monitor going forward too. So, so definitely a high priority for land drainage moving forward, Mr. Chairman.
And the other one I'd like to say is hopefully some of those assets we can do them in a better and smarter way for those replacements of, putting a plastic liner pipe up, pumping it up with concrete and we can actually get more water going down a plastic pipe than a concrete pipe without getting rid of the extra infrastructure can still stay there. So I hope a lot of those thoughts are going into those infrastructure replacements, so to keep the costs down as much as possible. So yeah, thank you. Uh, 23rd of May received. Oh, sorry. The flood protection and land drainage 2023 be received. Noel, Emma, thank you. All in favour?
All right.
Break, or do you want to just get into it?
So at the moment, we're only about 5 minutes ahead of schedule. Would members appreciate a 5-minute coffee toilet break?
Yep, thank you. Have a 5-minute break. Cheers.